In Baton Rouge, where I am currently the superintendent, we had schools that are underperforming that in the most poorest community, poorest neighborhood, where we've had tremendous increases in our poorest communities. One of the schools, Park Elementary, was actually recognized as one of they call the comeback schools, which are one of the 60 in the state of Louisiana. Now let me tell you how I would approach it here. One is I would look at a couple of things. Number one, what is the structure and setup of kids that are currently going there in terms of their pipeline of work? And what I mean by that is evaluating what they have done, what the teaching experiences have been in terms of what they've learning, and you do that by getting academic data. Also look at what are the type of supports that they have, because there's always this notion is I'm just gonna hire this top-notch teacher and they're just gonna walk into that school and they're just gonna do great. No. Usually schools where you have underperformance, there are a lot of other subset of things that you have to build in that structure. For example, you have to look at what are the additional resources that you put in to help kids to catch up. For example, do they have more intervention time? Do they have more time in tutoring? Do they have an extended day? Do they have more supports in terms of specific alignment to do professional development where you can pay teachers more to do extra days? Do they have additional coaches to be able to have those coaches work with teachers but also work with students directly? Do they have the type of technology to help them accelerate in looking at if the issues around reading or order of operations in math for schools? What's been the pattern of the neighborhoods that they come from? One of the things you learn, the reason I talk about community neighborhoods, is if you go to any neighborhood and community, when you look at neighborhood schools, you can literally see the kids that come out that neighborhood having the same set of challenges around language and math coming from that same neighborhood, going into that same school. Do you know why? Because in that community, there's probably a certain level of language that's spoken, a certain level of reading or not that's happening, a certain level of mathematics that's talked about or exposed to, a certain level of variations of things. And so you have to be able to know that in those areas, and we do what I call an asset mapping. That's why I tell folks you gotta break up communities so you can understand where their gaps are, so you can accelerate all kids. Because I tell folks, it's just not poor performing kids you gotta worry about. You gotta worry about every child in every school, regardless of where they're located. But you begin to do that to help accelerate their work. What I have learned was when we started putting things like additional time in schools for extended day, we started bringing in and working with groups like, we have a partner called City Year that help with extra tutoring in the school. When we started putting more additional coaches in the school, when we started putting access for kids to get health in the school, that began to change the dynamics and also help to change where they go back home to their families, right? Because they're not reinforced that at home. So you gotta remember, I tell folks it's not just the child you're worried about, you're also worried about where they go back home to. And so you have in those neighborhoods that pattern that you have to break. And you gotta work with partners, right? So for example, one of the things that I would suggest, and the reason I keep telling community partners, you look at, we do a lot of work with YMCA, which I would, if you know we have a YMCA here, Boys and Girls Club, or whatever partner that's in that community to help that. So when those kids are going there, they're getting the additional reading, they're getting the additional math. So you do shared agreements with them around data so they can get data because they're also putting dollars to help students too. All of those wraparound services is what helps to accelerate kids to do better. And kids are going somewhere, Dr. Holmes. Believe me when I tell you, sometimes the kids are staying home. They're not just staying home. And in some communities, like I learned, if you look at Boston's model, or if you look at what they did in Dallas or these other places, the extended day approach really works well, but you have to add more things to it. And if you only have those set of schools that are not performing well, how do we reallocate resources to them? Because remember, I know there's certain words you can't use now, but I tell folks the reality is every student doesn't need the same thing. Every community doesn't need the same thing, but you have to figure out how you allocate additional dollars to help them solve the problem they need to solve. And I would say in your schools, because it's a concentrated area, there should be some asset mapping data, not only what happens in the school, but in the community that they're coming from to be able to identify where that gap is. So now in the curriculum, you can work with teachers and say, hey, guess what? This child, when they come to you, they can't read at a certain level because they can't put words together. You can see that pattern coming in. So now you're working with teachers in professional development to help attack that particular issue. And I can bet you, without knowing the schools you're talking about, there is a pattern. Once that is identified, we put resources to show our return on investment on that.